Welcome to Sino-Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer. Today, based on historical records, numerous archaeological reports, theoretical discussions in Chinese military manuals, we're going to delve into fortifications, the crux of ancient defenses. It's a subject that could easily fill several hours, but we'll limit ourselves to 5 talks in all. Later on, we'll also talk about defense against siege and assault methods. Over the millennia, measures to ward off enemies and ensure the security of armies and cities have assumed many forms, including earthworks, stockades, mounds, ditches, moats, and pits. However, military bastions and fortified cities protected by massive walls have always been the most formidable. They not only provided protection against aggressors, but they also functioned as centers for imposing political control over the countryside. The inhabitants within them immediately became a kind of defined group with shared interests and a common desire to survive. That's essential during prolonged sieges, when group identity and psychological factors such as qi, combat energy or spirit, which we've discussed before, often prove more important than the solidity of the walls. Now, just as in the West, China's fortifications date far back to antiquity. As extensively discussed in my book, Ancient Chinese Warfare, and many dozens of archaeological reports in recent decades, wall building began in China more than 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Over time, hundreds of towns and cities were fortified, primarily by employing the earth itself. Now, for building large structures, such as castles and bastions, including Troy, Mycenae, and say the medieval cities such as Carcassonne in France, Aigues-Mortes, Rothenburg, to just 3 examples still visible today, the West has generally relied on timber and stone, whereas Asia has employed earth and bamboo. But like all sweeping characterizations, it's a vast oversimplification. Various explanations have been offered. Whatever their individual merit, arguments that early China lacked timber or the tools to quarry stone are certainly fallacious. Being a mountainous country, much of China's terrain, especially in the north where civilization emerged, was originally heavily forested, and there's been little noticeable difference in their tools, skills, or craft knowledge ever detected. However, the nature of the effort differs considerably. Timber and stone structures require felling trees, sawing beams, quarrying stone and cutting it to shape, and thus considerable time and, more important, strength. Now, while digging can be back-breaking work, it doesn't require the same muscle power as chopping a thick tree trunk. Merely determined, continuous effort. Warring States writings indicate that women, as well as men, were expected to participate, all in accord with their physical abilities. And when it comes to transportation, cumbersome, heavy items such as stone blocks require great effort to move over even easy terrain in short distances. In contrast, almost anyone can handle baskets carried by hand, and buckets of dirt suspended from poles. And they can readily deposit the contents almost anywhere. Carts, wagons, and rafts, of course, facilitate the process. Now, naturally, wood still had to be employed to a limited extent for gate frames and doors, and for the planks that would hold the soil in place while compacting it. But southern China, especially the Yangtze River Valley and below, has always been forested in bamboos that range in diameter from thin culms of the Pseudosasa japonica, better known as arrow bamboo, to species with diameters of 8 inches or more suitable for pipes, construction, even primitive flame throwers, and guns and eruptors. Contrary to likely impression, erecting a solid, functional wall out of sand, dirt, soil, earth, whatever term you like, isn't a simple process. Apart from the physical work involved and the need to suit the design to the topography, the soil's characteristics have drastic impact. Finely grained river or beach sand is, readily dug up, but it flows easily. When it's damp, it can be compressed and molded into the shapes that children like to create at the beach, but they have little strength beyond their inherent mass, and they quickly crumble once they dry out. Now, conversely, certain compositions, especially those incorporating finely dispersed organic matter or clay particles, are particularly suitable because of their inherent clinginess, to define our own technical term. Clay and clay-like soils, such as the famous sticky earth found in the Yellow River watershed, are therefore ideal. But they're difficult to excavate and hard to work unless you mix some sand in. In China, the first static defensive measures appear to have been ditches and pre-existing ravines. The soil from the shallow ditches was then sometimes employed to raise the village's overall height, creating a sort of elevated platform or mini mesa that afforded additional protection against flooding. However, by the start of the 3rd millennium BC, it was realized that walls offer better protection than ditches. Rather than raising the platform, they instead mounded the soil into continuous walls, often without any openings at all, which required the inhabitants to clamber over them to get in or out. Of course, the inconvenience soon prompted the creation of gates. This could require bringing the necessary soil some distance or employing stones, as in Inner Mongolia. However, when located close to the walls, the ditches normally provided the material, and at the same time they created a significant depression that effectively raised the height that aggressors would have to confront. The defenders were therefore able to employ their bows and arrows to slay the enemy's fighters while they tried to negotiate the loosely defined killing zone, and then forcefully strike down anyone who survived and attempted to clamber over the wall. There's also some evidence, although minimal, of post holes at a couple of sites, implying fencing or stockade walls were also erected as additional impediments. If the terrain was heavily watered, whether fed by a spring or a stream, the ditch could be turned into a moat, further increasing the difficulty of assaulting the town. Variants eventually included an inner ditch to impede aggressors who managed to get over the wall, trapping them in another lethal depression. Though not necessarily having the same extensiveness as the walls with which they were conjoined, early ditches generally reached widths of 30 feet or more. However, they rarely had the sort of inverted profile of the wall because they're mostly 5 or 6 feet deep. But that's deep enough to impede soldiers attempting to cross, especially when coupled with an undulating surface bottom that might be studded with deep pits or stakes. Swimmers might attempt to cross under a hail of archery fire, but rafts and boats would be needed to move scaling equipment into position. The heavier siege engines that appeared later could of course only be brought up if they filled the moat to create a temporary causeway. Now, over the centuries, the walls grew to widths of 50 to 70, even 100 feet or more, a formidable height of 30 to 40 feet, and total lengths that exceeded 40,000 feet or slightly under 8 miles. Since the work was tedious and tortuous, it might be asked why their dimensions so far exceeded what was functionally necessary. Psychological control of the people is usually suggested as the reason, but the energy could have much more productively been employed in farming and craft production. The debilitating nature of the work and the numerous injuries incurred also caused widespread disaffection, and it could turn violent, such as at the end of the Qin dynasty. Now, because mounded dirt erodes easily, pounding the earth to compress it to almost concrete-like hardness soon evolved in concord with the realization that the excavation of a foundation disc could also enhance the solidity. When properly compressed, pounded earth, known as hongtu, proved highly effective. Remnants have in fact withstood environmental degradation for more than 2,000 or 3,000 years. It was also eventually discovered that walls that employ a single soil type tend to be less stable than those constructed from interlaced layers of different types a few inches thick. The technology proved remarkably successful, and a concise body of knowledge quickly evolved about soil types how to layer them, part of China's development of civil engineering. Conversely, availability always limited the possibilities. Officials therefore had to weigh proximity, which required little or no wheeled or boat transport, against improved solidity and greater lifespan. Since spring and autumn historical records show that city walls frequently had to be repaired or rebuilt, there seems to have been a tendency to do less rather than more. Officials were punished, even executed, when flaws were reported. Comprehensive planning, thoroughgoing organization are required to construct conjoined walls and moats. The design and the dimensions had to be determined, the topographical features analyzed, the terrain's load-bearing capacity estimated. The construction has to proceed in sequential steps. The laborers have to be organized, and the diverse task of excavating the soil at designated sites, transporting it in reed baskets, depositing it in appropriate locations, watering as necessary, and then pounding for the lengthy period required to attain the hardness desired within these pre-positioned wooden frames systematically assigned. Core walls were sometimes prepared first. Many older walls were expanded more than once, often right out over previously excavated defensive ditches or moats, and exterior knee walls sometimes added for protection. Stones, small branches, even ground rice was sometimes added in response to specific local conditions to strengthen the wall and increase its integrity. Even the dowels that held the framing together were occasionally left incorporated. The frame was continually augmented as the wall grew in height and adjusted to create the contour necessary to prevent collapse, but without facilitating the task of ascending the wall for any attackers. So the interior had to be more of a sloping profile, but the exterior as vertical as possible. Even when they could exploit naturally occurring veins of loose soil, or they were digging along riverbeds, ancient workers wielding cumbersome bone and stone tools must have found the effort extremely taxing. Highly compressed soil, clay, intermixed pebbles and stones, even surface vegetation and roots had to be cut and cleared away, immeasurably lengthening the process. A few historians and experimental archaeologists have attempted to calculate the amount of time, the number of workers required to construct the walls found at certain sites. The results are interesting, and of course they're applicable to erecting China's famous long walls, as we will see. But the conclusions vary so widely as to justify just one deduction: an immense number. However, we can get a sense of the enormity of the task by applying a bit of imaginative analysis to the three main stages or components: excavating the soil, transporting it, pounding it. The key question is how much sand, dirt, or earth can be dug out per hour or day, assuming a relatively continuous effort, which in itself is already somewhat skewed because productivity falls off as people grow tired or struggle in adverse conditions, as we all know. Now, while the average person today, using a fairly sharp, well-contoured modern steel spade, maybe aided by a pitchfork, working in, moderately difficult soil, can dig up 10 or more cubic feet an hour. That's about a cubic yard every 3 to 4 hours. An experiment in China found a surprisingly meager amount of less than 1 cubic foot per hour could be managed using the stone and bone tools employed in antiquity. Now, bronze and then iron implements in the imperial period, which started at 221 BC, increased the efficiency, but the productivity of the average healthy worker probably never exceeded 3 or 4 cubic feet per hour. Now, assuming the lower number of 3 cubic feet per hour, or about a cubic yard per day, that's roughly twice the pace some people have projected. Just digging out the soil for an 8-foot high, small walled enclosure, square or circular, doesn't matter, with a 1,000-yard perimeter would have required 80,000 man-hours per 10 feet of width, or 8,000 workdays. Now, since early walls could range up to 50 feet, estimates of 50,000 workdays just for sourcing the material probably fall on the low side. Transporting the material, dumping it into prearranged frames, came next. It's a function of the distance, the difficulty of the terrain, whether it's carried in baskets individually or on poles, or if carts and wagons can be used, though they still require loading and unloading. Far less workers were probably required, so a reasonable estimate of 25% of the excavation force would perhaps be right. Finally, the earth had to be pounded. Thinness seems to be the secret to compacting the layers and achieving the extraordinary hardness required. So therefore, bundles of very small diameter branches or dowels were employed. Moreover, modern reconstructions have repeatedly shown that each layer requires hours of consistent work rather than just quickly tamping with a couple heavy stone weights if you want to achieve true, virtually sedimentary solidity. So let's say another 25% of the excavating force was probably required. Finally, a large number of support personnel would have been required to supervise the work, provide food, water, and clothing over extended periods, though corvée laborers, they were normally expected to sustain themselves. After completion, the fortifications requiring regular maintenance to prevent the growth of vegetation that might degrade the wall or provide the enemy with handholds, and occasionally had to be extensively repaired or rebuilt. The exposed surfaces seem to have been finished with a coating of sticky clay that congealed in the sun and was rendered as smooth as possible to prevent the enemy from ascending. Meanwhile, debris from the ever-eroding walls and the accumulating leaves, which could reduce the ditch's effectiveness as a defensive barrier, also had to be periodically cleared. Earthen walls were always susceptible to weathering. Rain wreaked the greatest havoc, but the drying effects of wind and sun, coupled with repeated cycles of heat and cold, expansion and contraction, they all degraded the integrity of the exterior portions. Even minor fissures might then rapidly expand. Stones were sometimes embedded to counter these effects, as well as the corrosive threat of nearby overflowing streams. But generally speaking, despite ceramic and earthenware techniques being highly advanced, mud and masonry bricks didn't play a significant role in defensive fortification until about the pre-Tang northern dynasties. This then resulted in walls such as depicted in the Wujing Zongyao, an imperially sponsored Song dynasty military compendium. And, of course, in the expansive and extraordinarily expensive Ming Great Wall. But even then, few walls were constructed solely of stone, as in the West, most of them being instead stone facings with earthen filling.